In corporate America, an arrogant executive's deadliest mistake is not firing the loud rebels. It is ignoring quiet people like me. Julian Vance thought he could bend the laws of physics for a promotion. He never realized the compliance engineer watching from the freezing corner had already tied his digital noose. When the sirens screamed and $3 million vanished every 24 hours, he finally learned. My cruelest revenge was simply smiling and letting him destroy himself. Welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. Dear listeners, we sincerely appreciate your continued support for our channel. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our videos, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon channel to hear exclusive, true, and even more incredible revenge stories. Those Patreon episodes are longer, feature highly detailed situations we cannot publicize on YouTube, and include multiple emotional voice actors bringing the stories to life in a single narrative. You can join us by scanning the Patreon QR code right on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's story as we step into the freezing shoes of our main character, Ivy Davis. Apex Frost. Logistics was not merely a workplace, it was a concrete and steel fortress of ice rising from the flat, freezing plains of suburban Illinois. It was a massive cold storage megacenter, where the internal temperature was strictly maintained at a bitter -20 degrees Celsius. Breathing in that environment felt like swallowing broken glass. Every inhalation stung your lungs, and the faint, ever-present smell of ammonia would periodically spike, burning the inside of your nose and causing your eyes to water uncontrollably. The massive cooling compressors roared endlessly, a deafening mechanical heartbeat that vibrated through the thick concrete floors. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a sick, flickering hum, casting harsh shadows over endless rows of frosted metal racks that reached up into the darkness of the ceiling. It was a hostile environment, meticulously designed to preserve dead inventory, perfectly indifferent to human life. I am Ivy Davis. At 34 years old, I worked as the Systems Safety Compliance Analyst for this frozen hellscape, while others huddled by the break room heaters during their short reprieves, aggressively rubbing their numb hands and exchanging idle gossip about upper management. I stayed moving. I did not engage in small talk. I deliberately blended into the pale gray background of the warehouse, wearing my heavy insulated jacket, thick gloves, and standard-issue safety gear, looking entirely unremarkable to the untrained eye. My only constant companion was a heavy-duty, shock-proof tablet encased in thick black rubber. I walked the narrow, freezing aisles like a silent ghost, my fingers constantly tapping on the screen. I documented everything: a misplaced wooden pallet, a blocked emergency exit door, a frayed electrical wire hidden behind a shelving unit. I recorded every single violation, no matter how minor it seemed to the executives sitting in their heated, comfortable offices miles away from the danger. The floor managers absolutely despised my presence. When I pointed out that coolant pipe number 4 was showing severe signs of corrosive wear and imminent failure, the shift supervisor just rolled his eyes at me. "We are running at maximum capacity, Ivy. We cannot stop the lines. Go find a burnt-out light bulb to report," he told me, completely dismissing the fatal risk. I did not argue, I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not throw a tantrum. I simply nodded politely, took out my tablet, and snapped several high-resolution photos of the deteriorating, frost-covered metal. I added a precise digital timestamp to each image and filed them away. I did not send them to the supervisor again. Instead, I uploaded the files into a highly secure, triple-encrypted folder on my personal server. I deliberately named that folder Upgrade Project 2026. Let them ignore the rust and the warning signs. I was quietly building an indestructible paper trail made of titanium. While management saw me as a bureaucratic nuisance, the people doing the heavy lifting saw me very differently. There was an unspoken, deep respect from the dock workers and the forklift drivers. They knew the executives treated them like disposable cogs inside a freezing machine. but they also knew I was constantly watching out for them. Late one Tuesday night, an older loader named Marcus walked past me in the loading bay. Without making eye contact, he subtly bumped his thick shoulder against mine and slipped a crumpled piece of paper directly into my glove. I unfolded it later in the privacy of the deafening compressor room. It was a hurried, shaky scrawl, warning me that automated crane number 7 was leaking highly flammable hydraulic fluid, dangerously close to the high-voltage power lines. Marcus and the others constantly risked their jobs, passing me this confidential information, because they understood a very simple truth. I was the only person in that entire corporate structure who actually cared whether they survived their brutal shifts and made it home to their families in one piece. The executives loved their visual metrics. On the main wall of the central warehouse floor, a massive digital dashboard displayed the daily delivery progress. It was a beautiful, flawless wall of blinking green lights, proudly showing order fulfillment running at 99% efficiency. It was a gorgeous lie built entirely on deferred maintenance, ignored safety protocols, and exhausted workers. Only I saw the real picture, on the hidden data board glowing on my heavily encrypted tablet. The reality of Apex Frost Logistics was a terrifying sea of crimson. The ammonia pressure warnings, the thermal degradation alerts, the structural fatigue reports, they were all flashing bright red. My private dashboard showed a massive facility pushed so far past its critical safety limits that a single major malfunction could blow half the warehouse into orbit. The executives were blinded by the bright green lights of their quarterly profits. I was just waiting in the shadows for the red lights to finally catch up to them. The nightmare did not begin with a sudden, catastrophic explosion. It started with the arrival of Julian Vance, our newly appointed executive vice president. He descended upon the frozen industrial plains of Illinois, straight from the sun-drenched hills of Silicon Valley. Armed with a degree in something utterly useless and an ego the size of a shipping container, he was a stark, almost comical contrast to the brutal world he now commanded. While the dock workers wore heavy, stained insulated coveralls to survive their shifts, Julian strutted across the frozen concrete floor in tailored, slim-fit Italian suit jackets without a tie. He sported pristine white designer sneakers that had never touched a single drop of machine grease. He reeked of an exotic, heavy cologne that cost more than Marcus made in a grueling 80-hour workweek. Julian did not talk about logistics, cold storage, or human endurance. Instead, he spoke entirely in hollow, exhausting corporate buzzwords. Every sentence out of his mouth was a toxic salad containing phrases like artificial intelligence, workflow optimization, and disruptive forward thinking. He looked at a massive warehouse filled with tired, freezing human beings operating heavy, highly dangerous machinery, and saw nothing but a massive spreadsheet waiting to be aggressively maximized. During his very first all-hands management meeting in the climate-controlled boardroom, Julian made his dangerous philosophy perfectly clear. He paced around the polished mahogany conference table, holding a sleek digital stylus like a symphony conductor, and openly mocked our carefully established safety protocols. These redundant procedures are clunky 20th century relics, he declared with a condescending, practiced smirk. We are moving at the speed of tomorrow, but our safety and compliance division is dragging us back to the Stone Age. To thunderous, sycophantic applause from the middle managers who were desperate to keep their jobs, he announced an immediate 40% reduction in the preventative maintenance budget. Those crucial funds, he proudly proclaimed, would be instantly reallocated to accelerate order processing speeds. Less time inspecting freezing pipes meant more time moving boxes out the door. It was a flawless, genius corporate strategy. Assuming you genuinely believed the fundamental laws of thermodynamics cared about your quarterly profit margins, I was scheduled to present the thermal degradation and pressure risk report right after his grand, theatrical speech. I stood up, quietly connected my heavy tablet to the main projector, and brought up the thermal scans showing the critically strained ammonia lines in Sector 4. I had barely spoken 3 sentences about the imminent danger of a catastrophic pressure failure when the screen suddenly went pitch black. Julian had grabbed the remote and aggressively turned off the projector right in the middle of my presentation. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, steepled his fingers beneath his chin, and sighed dramatically, looking around the room for an audience. "Ivy, is it?" he asked, looking at me as if I were a smudge of dirt on his immaculate white sneakers. "You are being a technophobe. You are letting irrational, outdated fear of the machinery hold back our true optimization potential. We rely on hard data here, not your endless paranoia." The entire board of directors chuckled on cue. I stood there in the deafening, heavy silence of a room full of cowards. I did not blush. I did not utter a single angry word in my defense. I simply stood perfectly still and blinked, absorbing the exact mocking tone of his voice, the arrogant tilt of his chin, and the faces of every single executive who laughed along with him. I committed that exact, humiliating moment perfectly to my memory. Julian was not merely an arrogant talker. He was a man of breathtakingly reckless action. The following week, he rolled out his ultimate disruption. He implemented a brand new, highly expensive proprietary software layer over our existing industrial control grids. This new system included a feature that made my blood run completely cold the moment I saw it. It granted upper management remote, unhindered override privileges. Whenever a machine internal safety sensor detected dangerous pressure levels or severe overheating and attempted to automatically throttle down to prevent a failure, Julian and his chosen executives could simply press a digital button on their smartphones and instantly override the safety mechanism. They could intentionally force the conveyor lines and the massive cooling compressors to run dangerously past their engineered physical capacity, remotely silencing the screaming alarms just to hit their daily delivery quotas. They were essentially strapping a massive rocket engine to a rusted, failing bicycle and aggressively patting themselves on the back for going incredibly fast. That was the precise moment my entire approach shifted. You cannot logically reason with a man who firmly believes his corporate title grants him magical immunity from physics. So, I completely stopped sending direct warning emails to upper management. I stopped bringing up compliance issues with the shift supervisors. To the casual observer on the floor, Ivy Davis had been successfully put in her place and thoroughly defeated by the brilliant new executive vice president. In reality, I went completely underground. I began constructing a secondary, deeply hidden database that I privately named the Death Log. Every single time Julian or one of his ambitious cronies used their new smartphone software to override a critical safety warning, I silently captured the exact digital footprint of their action. I recorded the machine identification number, the exact time of the override, the specific dangerous parameter they casually ignored, and the specific executive account that authorized it. Then, every single night at precisely 2 a.m, a customized, untraceable script I wrote would silently package all of that horrifying data, encrypt it heavily with military-grade protocols, and bounce it across secure global networks until it safely landed on a private, untouchable cloud server located deep in a mountain facility in Switzerland. I was no longer trying to prevent a fatal disaster. I was methodically, patiently gathering the undeniable evidence for the inevitable corporate murder trial. It happened during the graveyard shift, right in the middle of a brutal Tuesday night. The warehouse was pushing massive volumes of inventory to meet an impossible holiday deadline, the heavy machinery groaning under the immense strain of another forced production surge. A secondary ammonia distribution line, running along the rusted upper scaffolding of aisle 12, simply could no longer handle the extreme, artificial pressure spike caused by the continuously overridden cooling limits. The thick metal pipe did not just crack, it violently ruptured. A high-pressure geyser of freezing, toxic liquid exploded outward, instantly vaporizing into a blinding, suffocating white cloud of caustic gas. A young female worker named Sarah, barely 22 years old, was driving her pallet jack directly beneath the pipe when the structural integrity finally gave way. The chemical rained down on her exposed left arm, instantly burning through her thermal protective sleeve. Her scream pierced through the relentless, deafening roar of the cooling fans, a sound of pure, primal agony that stopped the entire loading dock dead in its tracks. She stumbled backward, clutching her instantly blackened and blistered skin, before collapsing onto the freezing concrete floor, falling unconscious from the overwhelming shock before she even landed. According to strict federal safety regulations, an incident of that magnitude mandated an immediate external emergency response. Paramedics and hazardous material teams should have been called the very second the toxic gas hit the air. Instead, the floor supervisor, terrified of losing his job for missing the hourly quota, frantically radioed upper management. Within minutes, Julian marched onto the dangerous floor, his face completely pale but his eyes entirely devoid of human empathy. He did not ask if Sarah was breathing. "Do not call 911, he barked, aggressively waving his hands to disperse the lingering toxic mist away from his expensive suit. He ordered 2 dock workers to illegally move Sarah's limp body into the isolated, poorly equipped internal medical room near the administrative offices. When she finally regained consciousness, trembling violently from the trauma and severe chemical burns, Julian did not offer her an ambulance transfer to a proper burn unit. He offered her a pen. He locked the heavy clinic door, stood menacingly over her narrow bed, and pushed a strict non-disclosure agreement onto her lap while she was still crying in pain. He essentially held her employment hostage, aggressively forcing her to sign away her legal rights and her voice in exchange for a measly $5,000 as a hazard bonus. He callously packaged a life-altering, agonizing injury into a cheap, silent corporate transaction. But Julian was not foolish enough to leave physical or digital loose ends. He fully understood that a signed paper trail was absolutely useless if a digital recording contradicted his clean narrative. Less than an hour after Sarah was quietly escorted out the back door and sent home in a company-paid taxi, I sat alone at my dark terminal and watched the internal network logs light up with illicit activity, using his highest-level executive administrator privileges. Julian remotely accessed the central security mainframe from the comfort of his office. He located the specific high-definition camera feed pointing directly at the intersection of aisle 12. With a few swift, deliberate keystrokes, he permanently deleted the exact 3 minutes of footage that perfectly captured the pipe bursting and Sarah collapsing to the ground. But his malice did not stop there. He dove much deeper into the core maintenance database, specifically altering the historic pressure parameters of that broken ammonia line. He blatantly manipulated the numerical data to make it look as though the internal pressure was perfectly normal leading up to the burst, officially logging the catastrophic mechanical failure as a simple, careless worker operating error. He was legally, permanently blaming the young victim for the severe chemical burns she had just suffered. What Julian completely failed to understand was that the digital landscape of that warehouse did not actually belong to him. It belonged entirely to me. I had accurately predicted his cowardly, track-covering habits weeks ago when he first began ignoring the safety protocols. Knowing exactly how men like him operated when backed into a dangerous corner, I had meticulously woven a stealthy, custom-written script directly into the underlying architecture of the company network routers. It was a ghost program, completely invisible to standard administrative audits and firewall scans. My script operated on a very simple, extremely elegant digital tripwire. The moment any user with high-level executive clearance initiated a deletion command on the main security video servers, my code would instantly intercept the execution sequence. It would automatically duplicate the exact video file 15 seconds before it was permanently erased from the main hard drive, silently transferring the pristine, unedited copy directly into my heavily encrypted external vault. While Julian sat in his office, smugly believing he had successfully wiped the slate clean and buried his crimes in the dark, I was already watching the high-resolution replay of his absolute guilt on my personal monitor, staring at the horrific, undeniable footage of Sarah screaming in the white toxic mist. Something fundamental and permanent broke inside of me. The quiet, methodical compliance analyst completely vanished, replaced by a force entirely different. I realized then that the infrastructure of our facility was not merely rotting from structural neglect. It was being actively weaponized by a man who was perfectly willing to bury innocent human lives just to secure his next financial quarter. The hot, blinding rage that initially spiked in my chest rapidly cooled, transforming into a terrifying, absolute calmness. My breathing steadied perfectly. My hands completely stopped shaking over the keyboard. I leaned back in my heavy chair, staring intensely at the flashing red alerts on my hidden dashboard, and made a silent, unshakable vow. Simply submitting a whistleblower report to a federal agency was no longer enough. Bureaucracy was far too slow, too forgiving, and too easily manipulated by highly paid corporate defense lawyers. No, Julian Vance needed to face something far worse than a standard compliance fine or a quiet resignation. I was going to construct a flawless, inescapable digital trap, step back into the shadows, and let him confidently, arrogantly sign his own career death warrant. Julian Vance was profoundly driven by a very specific, highly intoxicating number. A massive $2 million performance bonus was waiting for him at the absolute end of the fourth quarter. To secure that lucrative financial payout, he desperately needed to artificially inflate the profit margins by any means mathematically possible. Besides ruthlessly cutting the essential maintenance budget, his next major target was the facility's immense operational overhead. Apex Frost Logistics paid astronomical monthly premiums for industrial hazard insurance, a necessary expense given the deadly chemicals we housed. Julian, fueled by his infinite arrogance, formulated a reckless plan to aggressively slash those costs. He officially invited a highly prestigious private insurance auditing firm to conduct a comprehensive on-site evaluation of the entire warehouse. He firmly believed he could easily charm the visiting auditors with his slick, carefully rehearsed digital presentations. He fully intended to hide the rotting infrastructure behind his newly implemented optimization dashboards and secure a drastically reduced insurance rate to perfectly pad his end-of-the-year statistics. The precise moment the formal audit schedule appeared on the internal administrative calendar, I quietly went to work. I discreetly accessed the highly restricted corporate visitor registry. I absolutely needed to know exactly who was walking into my frozen fortress. Using a sophisticated, untraceable routing protocol that bounced my connection through multiple proxy servers across Eastern Europe, I carefully extracted my heavily encrypted evidence file. This was the massive digital dossier I had ironically titled Upgrade Project 2026, containing every suppressed warning, every overridden alarm, and the horrific details of Sarah's severe chemical burn. I did not send this package to a generic government hotline where it would simply languish in a bureaucratic queue for 6 to 8 months. Instead, I used a highly specialized digital drop point to anonymously leak the entire comprehensive dossier directly to a very specific senior inspector at the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration. This particular man had a fierce, legendary reputation in the heavy industrial sector. He was widely known as a relentless, unforgiving wolf who took immense personal pleasure in systematically dismantling corrupt corporate operations. Sending hard evidence to a massive federal agency usually means patiently waiting for a slow legal subpoena, but I had carefully arranged a much faster, infinitely more elegant delivery mechanism. I had done my extensive background research on the private insurance company Julian had so eagerly invited. I knew that for highly volatile chemical storage facilities, this specific insurance firm routinely contracted independent, highly specialized engineering consultants to properly assess catastrophic liability. The brilliant, unexpected twist in my plan was that the relentless federal inspector I had just anonymously tipped off was actually legally moonlighting as their lead independent consultant for this exact corporate audit. My anonymous package gave him all the terrifying, hidden context he needed before he even packed his briefcase. So, when the scheduled audit day finally arrived, this federal apex predator would simply walk right through the glass front doors of Apex Frost Logistics, completely legally, hidden perfectly under the harmless corporate disguise of a standard private insurance auditor. He was my ultimate, carefully constructed Trojan horse. With the major players moving into their proper positions, I needed to prepare the final digital battlefield. I logged into the central environmental control systems under the cover of running a routine, mandatory diagnostic check. I meticulously reconfigured the core warning architecture of the entire facility. For several months, Julian and his management team had artificially raised the system tolerance levels to constantly allow for their reckless, forced overproduction. I quietly, methodically lowered the maximum thermal threshold of the massive warehouse cooling grid back down to the true, absolute redline limits dictated by strict international safety standards. If the pressure inside those aging ammonia pipes reached that critical breaking point again, the system would immediately trigger a massive, undeniable physical response that nobody could hide. But I added one crucial, highly customized modification to the programming. I went deep into the local notification settings and completely disabled the audio warning alarms specifically designated for Julian Vance's plush executive corner office. When the massive system eventually started screaming for mercy, his soundproof executive suite would remain completely silent. He would not be bothered by the annoying, piercing sirens. He would be entirely, blissfully blind to the rapidly building crisis until he confidently made his final, fatal move. The elaborate trap was perfectly set. The digital explosive charge was securely wired, and the shiny detonator was resting comfortably right in Julian's own manicured hand. I certainly did not want to be anywhere near the physical blast radius when the inevitable explosion finally occurred. I submitted a formal written request to Human Resources for a 3-day personal leave of absence. In my detailed out-of-office automated email response, I politely informed the entire upper management team that I was taking a long, quiet weekend to go ice fishing on a remote, deeply frozen lake in northern Minnesota. I made it abundantly clear to everyone that I would be miles away from the nearest cell phone tower, completely unreachable by any form of modern electronic communication. I packed up my heavy insulated gear, powered down my workstation, and walked out into the freezing parking lot with a perfectly neutral expression. I left behind a flawlessly engineered, invisible disaster. Completely dormant, just patiently waiting for a greedy, arrogant executive to confidently step forward and trigger it all by himself. The highly anticipated day of the supposed insurance audit arrived at the absolute worst possible moment for the facility operations. It directly coincided with the most brutal peak of the holiday logistics rush. The warehouse was currently absorbing a terrifying, unprecedented backlog of inbound freight. Massive transport trucks were lined up for miles down the freezing Illinois highway, constantly pumping millions of pounds of deeply frozen inventory into a building that was already bursting at its physical seams. Inside the frozen fortress, the atmosphere was thick with frantic, desperate energy. The heavy machinery was groaning audibly under the immense, unyielding strain. The massive internal cooling system, which had been ruthlessly pushed past its safe operating limits for weeks, finally began to violently rebel against its digital restraints. Deep inside the central control hub, the operational dashboard abruptly shattered the illusion of stability. The comforting, complacent green indicators violently shifted into a frantic, flashing crimson. A harsh, rhythmic warning klaxon began to pulse through the management offices, signaling a catastrophic pressure buildup within the primary ammonia arteries. The federal inspector had arrived precisely on schedule, perfectly blending in under his harmless disguise as a mild-mannered corporate insurance consultant. He stood quietly in the corner of the chaotic control room, holding a sleek digital clipboard, quietly observing the mounting panic with the cold, calculating eyes of a seasoned apex predator. According to strict, non-negotiable international safety protocols, the rapidly climbing pressure gauge demanded an immediate and total cessation of all mechanical operations. Standard procedure dictated that the entire warehouse needed to be brought to a complete halt for a mandatory 4-hour shutdown. This critical window was absolutely necessary to safely bleed the excess, highly volatile ammonia gas from the strained metal pipes and prevent a deadly explosion. However, initiating that emergency shutdown would entirely paralyze the outbound supply chain during the most profitable shift of the year. It would definitively cause Julian to miss his critical quarterly delivery quota right in front of the very people he was desperately trying to impress. It would instantly vaporize his highly anticipated $2 million executive bonus. The tension inside the control room was physically suffocating, thick enough to choke on. The terrified shift managers stared intensely at Julian, desperately waiting for the inevitable, legally required order to evacuate the freezing floor. Instead of protecting his people, Julian confidently smoothed the pristine lapels of his expensive Italian suit jacket. He aggressively ignored the flashing red screens and glanced over at the disguised federal inspector, offering a tight, utterly arrogant smirk. He was determined to demonstrate his absolute, unyielding control over the massive facility, fully believing he could simply bully the physical machinery into submission just like he bullied his employees. He walked purposefully toward the central command terminal, his pristine white sneakers squeaking sharply against the polished concrete floor. The inspector stood just a few feet away, perfectly still, his arms casually crossed over his chest, while a tiny, deeply hidden microphone pinned to his collar captured every single panicked breath and arrogant sigh in the room. Julian reached into his tailored pocket and confidently pulled out his heavy plastic executive identification badge. He swiped the card across the main security reader with a dramatic, theatrical flourish, the machine emitting a sharp, confirming beep that echoed above the blaring alarms. He deliberately turned his head, ensuring he had the complete, undivided attention of his entire management team and the visiting auditor. He took a deep breath and delivered his commands with loud, unshakable confidence, firmly believing he was the smartest man in the room. Override the safety system, force the compressors to run at an additional 30% capacity. I am taking responsibility. He aggressively slammed his hand down on the large flashing digital confirmation button on the touchscreen. He fully expected the familiar deafening roar of the heavy machinery instantly kicking back into overdrive. He fully expected the terrifying red warning lights to immediately submit to his authority and turn back to a profitable green. He fully expected a triumphant, highly lucrative victory over the fundamental laws of physics. But the massive industrial control grid did not restart the freezing lines. His digital command, explicitly authorized by his own unique biometric swipe and his spoken words, slammed directly into the invisible, waiting wall of my dormant ghost code. The Trojan horse finally burst open with devastating precision. Instead of an engine roaring to life, a horrifying, mechanical silence briefly swept across the massive warehouse, followed immediately by the terrifying sounds of a facility violently defending itself from its own leadership. The override command acted as the ultimate trigger, in perfect, terrifying synchronization. Massive, heavy steel blast doors violently slammed down over every single cargo loading bay, permanently locking the outbound inventory inside the freezing vaults with a series of deafening, metallic crashes. The automated magnetic locks engaged instantly, effectively sealing the building. Simultaneously, from the high vaulted ceilings of the warehouse floor, thick, heavy chemical containment tarps deployed with a rapid, violent snapping noise. They aggressively dropped down to the concrete floor, completely sealing off the highly dangerous, overpressurized ammonia sections into completely airtight quarantine zones. The entire facility essentially folded in on itself, entering an impenetrable defensive posture that no local administrative password could ever reverse. While the physical warehouse locked itself down, my customized software was working flawlessly deep within the network architecture. In a matter of milliseconds, the code automatically bundled the undeniable digital proof of Julian's reckless override command. It seamlessly merged that final piece of evidence with the massive, encrypted archive of his previous cover-ups, including the deleted security footage of Sarah's severe chemical burn. Without a single moment of hesitation, the system violently fired those massive data packets in two separate, highly lethal directions. One undeniable file went straight into the secure private servers of the corporate headquarters board of directors. The second, identical file was blasted directly into the highest-level federal enforcement database of the Occupational Safety Agency. There was no possible undo button. There was absolutely no way to delete the secure transmission. The digital execution was absolute, pristine, and entirely irreversible. Julian stood entirely frozen in front of the central terminal, his manicured hand still hovering uselessly over the completely dead touchscreen. The aggressive, flashing red lights of the command center painted his horrified, sweating face in a violent, pulsing crimson glow. He slowly turned his head toward the gray-haired man he still foolishly believed was just a simple, easily manipulated insurance auditor. Julian's mouth opened and closed repeatedly, gasping for air, but his vocal cords failed to produce a single comprehensible sound. The inspector remained remarkably calm. He casually placed his digital clipboard down onto the cold metal surface of the control desk. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored blazer and slowly, deliberately withdrew a heavy, solid gold federal enforcement shield. He tapped the solid metal badge against the steel desk, the sharp, heavy clinking sound echoing loudly and clearly in the sudden, terrifying quiet of the completely paralyzed control room. The inspector looked directly into the terrified, wide eyes of the shattered executive and spoke with a devastating, absolute authority that stripped away every ounce of Julian's power. "Mr. Vance, you have just personally triggered a federal Level 1 lockdown procedure." In that exact, beautiful moment, every single drop of blood completely drained from Julian's face, leaving him looking exactly like the frozen, utterly lifeless inventory he had tried so desperately to move. The lockdown of the Apex Frost facility was instantaneous and completely absolute. The deafening roar of the massive cooling compressors violently shuddered to a complete halt, replaced by a haunting, heavy silence that the warehouse had not experienced in decades. Hazardous material teams swiftly moved through the sealed corridors, safely venting the highly toxic ammonia gas out of the facility through emergency extraction protocols. But while the immediate physical danger was neutralized, the entire logistical heart of the massive operation was permanently frozen in place. Nothing moved. Every single one of the massive transport trucks lined up outside was permanently turned away at the main gate. The brutal, unforgiving financial reality immediately set in for the corporate boardroom. The deliberately shattered supply chain was heavily bleeding $3 million every single day. The massive steel doors remained sealed. Inside the paralyzed control room, Julian spiraled into a pathetic, desperate, and entirely public panic. The carefully manicured facade of the brilliant Silicon Valley executive completely melted away, leaving behind a terrified, cornered animal. He frantically tried to shift the massive weight of the disaster onto anyone else. Standing surrounded by furious shift managers and federal agents, he pointed a trembling finger at the local technology director and screamed at the top of his lungs, "This is a setup. It is a malicious, unauthorized system error installed by that quiet compliance employee, Ivy Davis. Open the administrative access logs, right now. I want her investigated and arrested immediately." He was desperately clawing at the walls, actively trying to turn my invisible presence into his perfectly convenient scapegoat. However, the technology director did not find a single trace of my digital footprints anywhere in the central system. The final, devastating twist of my carefully laid digital snare was the absolute, terrifying purity of the evidence it produced. When the massive data packet was officially unpacked by the federal authorities and the furious corporate board of directors, the truth was blindingly clear. The comprehensive digital report unequivocally proved that every single overridden safety warning, every deleted security camera file hiding Sarah's severe chemical burn, and every manipulated pressure parameter carried the exact, undeniable biometric fingerprint and the exclusive executive identification code belonging solely to Julian Vance. There was absolutely no room for interpretation. My cleverly disguised Upgrade Project 2026 folder had brilliantly transformed into an impenetrable shield, legally protecting every single vulnerable worker on the floor, while simultaneously acting as a perfectly constructed guillotine pointing its sharp blade entirely at him. The corporate fallout was spectacularly swift and utterly merciless. The chief executive officer of the entire logistics empire flew directly into Illinois on his private jet just 48 hours after the lockdown was initiated. He was absolutely livid. He did not even allow Julian to step foot inside the frozen building to pack his belongings. Right there in the freezing asphalt parking lot, under the bleak gray sky, surrounded by hundreds of dock workers and forklift drivers who had gathered to watch the execution. The chief executive officer fired Julian on the spot, but losing his prestigious job and his highly anticipated $2 million bonus was merely the beginning of his nightmare. As Julian stood there shivering in his thin designer suit, two federal marshals stepped forward from the crowd. They immediately escorted the arrogant former vice president away, his wrists securely bound in heavy steel handcuffs. He was officially facing severe federal felony charges for intentionally forging safety records, criminal negligence, and reckless endangerment of human life. I casually returned to work the following Monday morning, entirely refreshed and perfectly relaxed from my quiet ice fishing trip up north. The chaotic energy of the previous week had completely vanished. I walked into the administrative office and found my small desk in the corner looking exactly as neat as I had left it. Waiting patiently for me right in the center of my desk was an immaculate, thick envelope sent directly from the elite corporate legal department in New York. In a desperate, terrified effort to keep me permanently quiet and successfully avoid a massive, completely unwinnable class action lawsuit, the corporation had proactively drafted a heavily negotiated severance contract. It was a massive, silent thank you package. The financial compensation explicitly outlined in the clean legal document was equal to 5 entire years of my salary, fully guaranteed and completely tax-protected. I sat down in my comfortable chair for one last time. I took a slow, incredibly satisfying sip of my hot morning coffee. I calmly picked up my favorite blue pen and signed my name on the massive settlement check with a steady hand. I gently packed my small green potted cactus into a cardboard box, firmly tucked my heavy shock-proof tablet under my right arm, and smiled softly as I walked out the glass front doors into the bright winter morning. I never had to raise my voice to demand respect. I never had to shout a single angry word in self-defense, but the beautiful, devastating sound of that arrogant executive's entire career violently collapsing to the ground echoed far louder and much sweeter than any scream ever could. Thank you so very much for taking the time to listen to this story today. We would absolutely love to know where in the world you are listening from. So please let us know in the comments. If you truly enjoyed today's journey, we humbly ask that you help support us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel. Over there, you can listen to our absolute best, exclusive, and completely true revenge stories that feature incredible details we simply cannot publicize here on YouTube. You can easily join our community right now by scanning the Patreon QR code displayed directly on your screen, or by clicking the convenient link provided down in the video description or in the pinned comment section.